Okay. So I talked about segmenting, and I said one way that you can, one method of segmentation could be buying situations. We typically call this by class. And there are three that we typically talk about. The first is what we call a straight rebuy. So this is a routine, very low involvement purchase. You have very minimal, very limited information needs. You don't consider a lot of alternatives. And so, the buyer typically has extensive experience with the seller. They think the service or the product itself has been satisfactory, so they don't really need to do a bunch of research. They also, of course, think that the price is satisfactory. And so you could think of something like copier paper, right? So if you're buying copier paper, you might not look past Michael Scott's company, right? You might not look past Dunder Mifflin because you're like, oh, we just need to buy paper and it's not that big of a deal. Prices haven't gone up. We might as well just stick with these people. In these kind of relationships, the supplier typically makes an effort to maintain product and service quality, and they often try to push automatic reordering, right? And you do that, you might push automatic reordering systems or kind of automatic reordering timetables. And you do that and you pitch it to the seller, or I'm sorry, the buyer by saying, let me save you time, right? So, out suppliers or other suppliers, they usually attempt to offer something new or exploit any dissatisfaction that you may have. If you think Dr. Mifflin has reduced their service quality, their paper quality, their product offerings, you might say, hey, I know that you might not be the happiest with Dunder Mifflin. Why don't you consider us? We saw, again, if you saw The Office, you saw that happen, that companies were choosing other places to buy their paper because it turns out Dunder Mifflin was slightly more expensive. And so other companies were being approached by other suppliers and being told, hey, we can cut the cost of your paper needs. That happens, right? So the second buying situation or buy class would be what we call a modified rebuy. So in a modified rebuy, the buying situation is such that you might keep the same buyer or the same vendor, your same supplier, but you change the order slightly, right? So you might upgrade or downgrade your paper quality. You might decide that rather than buying 60 reams of paper per day, you need to push that up to 80 because you're expanding greatly, right? You might decide that instead of buying hand sanitizer or, I'm sorry, hand wash product, you know, and toilet paper from a supplier, you've decided that you also need to add hand sanitizer and you want to add toilet seats, right? So you have a modified rebuy. Um, in the in the period where you have a modified rebuy, it can create kind of a positive for both the buyer and the supplier. So for the buyer, the modified rebuy allows them to purchase the same product or services with modifications that arguably better meet their needs, right? It can also be much easier. You already know this seller, you already know what kind of quality they provide, so on and so forth. So you don't have to do as much looking around to find someone to now provide your toilet seat covers and your hand sanitizer. You'll just go with the guy who's giving you, or woman who is offering you, your toilet paper. Like, oh, okay, I'll just kind of, adapt what I need a little bit. For suppliers, the modified rebuy process helps retain customers, right? And helps you keep their business, right? It also can potentially help you strengthen your relationship, right? Essentially, if you are a seller, if you're a marketer, what you want to do is you really want to be able to provide value. You want to meet the customer where they are and provide value added service. And modified rebuy allows you to do that, right? You could think of something like desktop computers. Yesterday, I went out and did some work with my with a colleague of mine at a coffee shop, right? So if you are a company and you've been buying desktop computers from a seller, you can go in and say, listen, we're not going to use desktop computers. We're going to use laptops going forward. I know you sell both. Microsoft, give us laptops for everyone so our employees can be more mobile. I was mentioning my friend, I kind of did this spacey, but I was mentioning my friend because she has that, what do you call that? She has the new kind of tablet that's as thin as, like, they say it's as thin as paper. It's not really as thin as paper, but it's very, very thin. It's supposed to mimic paper. And she's using that because her job is providing those tablets now, because they realized they didn't want to keep buying paper, right? They wanted to provide something maybe a little bit better for their people. So anyway, she told me she got it, and she liked it, but what she found that she didn't like was the stylus that you use with it, right? So if you're her company, and you bought these products for your people, and it turns out that your people like the product and it works very well for you all, but you don't like the stylus, you can go back to the supplier and say, hey, do you have an upgraded stylus? This one is not meeting our needs, right? This would be a modified rebuy situation. A new task purchasing situation is when a company is purchasing a product or some kind of service, and they're doing so for the first time, hence the idea of new task, right? It's a new task situation. In many cases, the greater the cost or the greater the risk, the greater or larger the number of people who will be a part of the decision making. So if it's something like, we're buying a new building or we're creating an add-on for a building, that might have many, many, many people. On the other hand, many. On the other hand, you could say something like we're buying new computers, or we're buying new monitors, or we're replacing our desktops with laptops. And you might have more people, but you might have more than a few people, but it's not going to be significantly more than a few usually. So you're going to have more people. You probably will have larger efforts to collect data, right? Because you need to know what your alternatives are. You need to know a lot of things. You need to know how much it's going to cost from this marketer versus that marketer, so on and so forth. For marketers, new task purchasing situations are a big opportunity and a big challenge, right? So you need to kind of reach out and connect with and be impactful and persuasive to as many of the key players as possible. You need to provide as much information as they may need, which can be tricky. And one of the reasons it can be tricky is sometimes the buyer doesn't know the information that they need, right? So they might decide, hey, we're buying new laptops for everyone, right? But they might not know exactly what they need laptops to do, right? So you're like, oh, okay, well, we need it to be mobile so people can walk around with it. You're like, oh, okay, great, you need it to be mobile. But what they don't tell you is they also need these laptops for IT services, right? And, someone who, the secretary, every person from the secretary to IT services. And so the capacity of the laptops might need to change. They might need different laptops with different capacities, so on and so forth, right? There are a lot of decisions that need to be made when it comes to new tasks, right? You need to know product specifications, price limits, payment options, payment terms, order quantities. You need to have delivery times figured out, service terms. It's just a lot of work. It's a lot of work for the buyer. It's a lot of work for the marketer. And what you have to do is you have to have a lot of patience, and you have to be very kind of on board and willing to kind of do a lot of work with the buyer. I tend to like this buying situation grid. It looks at key elements of kind of each buying, so key elements for each buying situation. So for new task, modified rebuy, and straight rebuy, from a newness of the problem standpoint, the newness of the problem is quite high when it comes to new task. I mean, it's called new task for a reason. Medium for a modified rebuy, and then low for a straight rebuy. Information requirements tend to be the most for a new task, right? Because you're buying something totally new. Moderate for a modified rebuy, and then minimal for a straight rebuy, because again, you're just buying something that you've already purchased many times, so you don't need new information. And then consideration of new alternatives, pretty important when you're buying something new, limited when you're on a modified rebuy, and then pretty much non-existent when you're looking at a straight rebuy. So I like this grid. I think it tells us a lot in a short amount of words, small amount of words. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I thought this was great, a great graphic in terms of examples of purchasing situations. So straight rebuy, it could be bulk chemicals, it could be spare parts or office supplies. Modified rebuy, business cars, courier services, computer terminals if you need those, because we're still in 1990. I'm joking. In terms of new task, it could be buildings, like it could be something as big as buildings, production equipment, telephone systems, again, because we might be in 1990. But yeah, I think this is a pretty interesting graphic. So there are three elements to organizational buying behavior. The first element is structure, which we call the who factor, who participates in the decision making, which we'll talk about a bit more as we move through these slides. So an essential point to understand in organizational buying is that the buyer or purchaser is often, not the only person who influences the decision or who makes the ultimate decision. There can be, particularly for large companies, many people who participate in the buying process. And so the more people who participate in the buying process, of course, the more difficult it is to be a marketer, because you have to kind of sell to all of the people in the process. You need to make, in some way, shape, or form, all of those people happy, or at least satisfied with the product or service that you're trying to bring to the table, right? You're trying to get them to buy. We often call the people who kind of participate in the buying process the DMU, or decision-making unit. It's just one thing I learned when I got into corporate is that there are a lot of acronyms. There are a lot of abbreviations. There are just a lot going on that you need to know. I think when I first started, the first thing they did was give me a book so that I knew what a lot of things meant. So one of the primary tasks that you have is to identify and reach key target members, right? Who's important. And you want to avoid two, what I say, key issues. The first is the comfort zone. You want to make sure that you're just not walking into a situation where people are in a comfort zone and they don't move, right? That means that because if you do, that means that it becomes very, very tricky to create any kind of, build on what you already have. So if you're already selling them X number of products, if you go in and you want to sell them X plus Y number of products, that can be tricky because they are in a comfort zone. If you have a new product, that can be tricky, or service, that can be tricky because they are in a comfort zone. You want to make sure that they are not just like, we're only buying X, we're only doing X, we only have X. I mean, if they do that, then your job as a marketer is to kind of break them out of that comfort zone. You also want to avoid the naysayers and spending too much time with naysayers. Quit spending time with too many people who believe nothing is possible, believe that, relationships can't change, believe that the comfort zone is what it is. You don't want to spend all your time with people who are super negative and who are really against what it is you're trying to do. So when we're trying to figure out who buys, right? Who in the buying center, who in the decision making unit buys, again, it's going to be a wide variety of people, and we have kind of labels for each one of these people. The initiator is usually the person who begins the process of considering a purchase. That person might gather information to help make the decision. So Wayne, the business school, is hiring someone in marketing this year. I'll give you an example of an initiator. We're hiring someone in marketing. The way it typically goes, this is my second school. When we hire someone, who knows how many applications we get, but I won't see most of these applications. I won't say most, but several of the applications will be pruned before I even kind of take a look at them, because, whoever's heading up the hiring committee will prune them. They will go through and say, this person doesn't have a PhD, won't have a PhD, they're not qualified technically, so on and so forth. This happens quite a bit. A lot of times when it comes to buying, the seller will often have, you never know who the person is that's making the initial fact finding, who's kind of pruning out suppliers, which again is one of these reasons why when you walk into one of these situations, you want to be nice to everybody, because everybody will have some say, even if it's small. They can kind of, the secretary might make it known that you were rude to them, and then that just kind of cuts you off from the list. The influencer is the person who attempts to persuade others in the group regarding the outcome or decision, what supplier to go through, what products to buy, what services to buy, so on and so forth. They typically gather information, so that's one great thing about influencers. They will gather information. The bad thing, of course, is that they attempt to impose their choice criteria, whatever decisions, whatever evaluative criteria that they use. They would like to enforce that with the group and say, this is the evaluative criteria that we all should use. And that might not necessarily be the case for everyone. Not everyone will agree with that. Gatekeepers are people who control the flow of information. Now, this very likely could be an admin person, right? Oftentimes, you may be emailing the CEO or emailing the CFO. But the person who actually sees those emails is their admin person or persons, and they control the flow of information. They might not send an email that you send through for, hours, if not days. Who knows? They would be gatekeepers. Deciders, the people who actually have the power and authority, financial authority, to make the ultimate choice. These are the people who say, yeah, we're going to go with option C, right? And then the buyer, the person or persons who make the transaction, right? They're the people who visits the store if they need to. They make the payment. They make decisions about delivery, like, deliver it on this day, yada, yada. And then the user, the actual end consumer. Okay, I'm so sorry. There's a protest going on outside my building. I don't know. I'm just trying to record this lecture. I had no idea there was going to be a protest. My apologies.